Okay, so now we get to the gospel passage, which continues on with Matthew 25. If you remember, last week I mentioned that we're in the midst of 3 weeks in a row hearing from Matthew 25, which comes right at the end of Jesus' public ministry. So in other words, you think about this. Jesus has been preaching and teaching for about 3 years, and now he knows that he's about to face his arrest, his trial, his death, ultimately his resurrection. And so he's wrapping everything up as far as doing things in public and preaching in public. So what is it that he's going to preach about the most? Well, he's preaching about judgment, actually. If you remember last week, there was the parable of the wise and the foolish virgins, those who didn't have enough oil in their lamps and those who brought extra oil so that when the bridegroom came, they were ready for him. And those who were foolish, they were left standing outside knocking, and they had to hear the response from the bridegroom who says, "Amen, I say to you, I never knew you." It's just like, oh man, that's rough, right? So that's what we don't want to hear. So now we're continuing on with this theme of judgment. Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30. And just so you know, there is an option for a shorter version to cut out a chunk from the middle of the verse, or from the middle of the passage. So anyway, so that's a possibility. Anyway, Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. Here we go. Jesus told his disciples this parable. A man going on a journey called in his servants and entrusted his possessions to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to a third 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. Immediately the one who received 5 talents went and traded with them and made another 5. Likewise the one who received 2 made another 2. But the man who received one went off and dug a hole in the ground and buried his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants came back and settled accounts with them. The one who had received 5 talents came forward, bringing the additional 5. He said, "Master, you gave me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more." His master said to him, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. Since you were faithful in small matters, I will give you great responsibilities. Come, share your master's joy." Then the one who had received 2 talents also came forward and said, "Master, you gave me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more." His master said to him, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. Since you were faithful in small matters, I will give you great responsibilities. Come, share your master's joy." Then the one who had received the 1 talent came forward and said, "Master, I knew you were a demanding person, harvesting where you did not plant and gathering where you did not scatter. So out of fear I went off and buried your talent in the ground. Here it is back." His master said to him in reply, "You wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I did not plant and gather where I did not scatter. Should you not then have put my money in the bank so that I could have got it back with interest on my return? Now then, take the talent from him and give it to the one with 10. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will grow rich. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And throw this useless servant into the darkness outside, where there will be wailing and grinding of teeth." Woo! I would not want to be that third servant, let me tell you. Well, okay, so if that's the case, and this is the purpose of this parable, or at least part of the purpose. I'd say there's probably a couple of purposes. This for sure is one of them, that he finishes with this sort of right hook, just like, okay, throw this useless servant into the darkness outside where there's going to be wailing and grinding of teeth. And of course, we know the parable, or hopefully we know this, that the parable is about our final judgment. And so the wailing and grinding of teeth is speaking ultimately about eternal separation, we call damnation, eternal separation from the Lord. We don't want that, hopefully. So then it's like, okay, well, how can I get to a point where I hear the words from the Lord, "Well done, my good and faithful servant"? I was just thinking of this, even as we were reading, something struck me in a new way. Okay, let's get back to the beginning. So Jesus continues to tell these parables. In fact, so we didn't get in our reading, but verse 14, it says, "It will be as when a man who was going on a journey called in his servants." So it will be. So in other words, Jesus is saying, like, this is what the judgment is going to be like. The kingdom of heaven, if you remember last week, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins. So the coming of the kingdom, the second coming, which again, just to be really clear about this, the second coming of Jesus could be your death. Because when you die, the letter to the Hebrews says, men die once, and then after that there is a judgment. So when you die, it will be as the second coming of Jesus for you. Or it could also be the second coming of Jesus before you die. We don't know. This is part of the deal here. We don't know when Jesus is coming. And in fact, it's his preferred way of doing this. Because if we knew when he was coming, what would happen? Well, he's not coming during my life, or he's not coming for a few more years yet, so I can live a life of debauchery. And Jesus doesn't want that. He wants people who are sincere in their eagerness to wait for him, and people who are prepared for when he comes, because he's going to come. We're going to hear this actually in our second reading. The second reading is really good. He's going to come at an unexpected time, at an unknown hour, and so we need to be ready, like a thief. Like if a thief was going to break into our house, we would be ready for him, right? So that's the idea here, is we just don't know when he's coming. So anyway, so Jesus said, a man going on a journey called his servants and entrusted his possessions to them. So this I think is a fascinating thing. We're going to jump around a little bit. This third servant, what does he say? He says, Master, I knew you were a demanding person. A demanding person. So he's a demanding person. And yet, what happens? At the beginning of the parable, a man, he calls his servants and does what? He entrusts his possessions to them. He's like, here, take these. I'm going away. Take these. It's like demanding or generous, maybe, actually. So it's a fascinating thing. And one commentator I was listening to, he talked about how this, it just shows what sin can do to us. What the sinful inclination, it's called concupiscence. One of the results of sin is that it breaks our relationship with God, and it causes us to see God in a different way. Before the fall, in the beginning, with Adam and Eve, they understood that God was like a loving father, a providential father, that they could have a kind of communion with him. But then after the fall, after their original sin, what do? They hear God coming and they hide from him. They see the relationship with God is broken, and now, rather than as like a loving father, a loving creator, now he's more like an adversary, an enemy. And so this plays itself out here in this parable, where he's like, I know you're a demanding person, and so out of fear of you, what did I do? I hid your money in the ground. It's a result of the fall, that our vision of God becomes distorted, our vision of the master, who is so generous in giving to us everything, right? He gives us life, he gives us food, he gives us clothing and shelter, and it might seem to us like, well, no, I've earned this, I've made this for myself. Okay, but then even there, God gave you the ability, God gave you life, right? He's so generous with us, and above all, he gives us his grace in all kinds of different ways, these talents that he gives. Okay, so back to the beginning. So he entrusts them his possessions, and he gives them talents. Now this is a tricky thing. We think of talent, and we think of this sort of like innate ability that I have or that you have. And we understand actually that some of us have more talent than others. Some of us are more talented people. We say that, well, he's a really talented guy or she's a really talented gal. That person's not very talented, but, and then what do? Well, I'm sure there's something there that could be considered a talent, right? We do this. And in fact, someone else that I was listening to said that we actually get our English word talent from this particular parable, which I think is a fascinating thing, that part of our English language comes from the Bible. Like, oh, that makes sense, actually, because it was something that was read for a whole bunch of people, or for a whole bunch of time, by a whole bunch of people. So anyway, so he entrusted his talents. Now, what is a talent? So at the time of Jesus, a talent was something that had monetary value. It was like a particular, you give a silver coin or a gold coin, and it was worth a considerable amount of money. So this talent that Jesus entrusted to them would have been worth something like 15 to 20 years of wages, of salaries. So let's take like a modest salary. So he's a king, so he actually probably would have had a bunch of money. But let's take a modest salary of, like, let's say someone made $50,000 a year, and they gave a talent worth 15 years worth of $50,000 a year. What's that worth? That's worth a little under $1 million. So if someone gives 5 talents, what's that going to be worth? It's going to be worth like $3.8 million. So when it says that he gave him 5 talents, it's like he gave him a bunch of money. I can't imagine someone just handing me $3 or $4 or $5 million. I can't imagine that. So this king is doing that, and then to another he gives 2, which, okay, it's not 5, but, well, what's 40% of 4 million is going to be a lot. Sorry, I should have figured this out. It's going to be like $3.5 million or something, or not 3.5, $2.5 million or something like that. Or maybe $1.5 million. Whatever. Math. I should have figured this out beforehand. I actually like math. I'm sorry. So anyway, he gives these people a considerable amount of money to use for what? Ultimately, for whatever. I mean, there was this expectation, I suppose, that they were going to use it to expand his resources, and that's kind of what makes them big. But anyway, he's very generous. Okay, then he went away. Immediately, the one who received went and did what? He traded. There's a vigilance here. There's a diligence, which this maybe is part of our connection with our first reading. If you remember, the woman of valor, the worthy wife, the one who is resourceful, the one who is diligent and disciplined, the one who is so good at being a faithful wife, but also just good at being a strong person interiorly. She's got this interior richness that ultimately is rooted in love of the Lord that causes her to be diligent and disciplined. And so these servants, these two good servants, who are what? Good and faithful servants, they immediately go and trade. They're diligent about okay, he gave us this incredible gift. We got to go and multiply it. We got to go and use it for his purposes, so that when he returns, we can be ready and eager to share with him what we did with it. So I think that diligence, that discipline is going to be a really good thing. Okay, but then what? The man who received one went off and dug a hole in the ground and buried his master's money, which we've already seen doesn't turn out well for him. But then this I think is a good connection with last week. So it says, after a long time, the master of those servants came back. If you remember last week, the virgins, they went and they were prepared, and the thing that kind of caught half of them, unexpected, was that it said after a long delay, or when he was long delayed, they all fell asleep. Everyone fell asleep, but some of them had the extra oil and some did not have the extra oil. And so that's what separated the wise from the foolish ones. So here, what's going on? The master is gone for a long time. After a long time, so you can actually think about the one who buried the money in the ground. He's just well, it's just sitting there. It's just sitting there. It's just sitting there. You could almost imagine him becoming a little consumed with it in some ways, because he's afraid of losing the money. And so he's maybe going back and checking on it. He's maybe regularly just I got to make sure it's still there. I got to make sure it's still there. Just acting kind of weird. While the other ones are just diligently getting after it and trying to growing excited maybe about expanding the resources of the king, the master. So anyway, so then there's this big reckoning, which again shows us what? It shows that we're going to be held accountable for the talents that God has given to us. And what are these talents? Well, they are the natural gifts and abilities, of course, that we all know that we have. But then we also, as Christians, believe that God gives us spiritual gifts. We call these charisms, that he gives us these spiritual gifts, and these spiritual gifts are made to be used maybe in accord or in congruence or whatever, together in complement to our natural gifts, to use them all for the purpose of multiplying the resources of our master, multiplying or expanding the kingdom of the master. That's the purpose of them. So that ultimately when we face our reckoning before the Lord, when we settle accounts with him, what happens? We come forward and we're just Master, look what we did. Look what I did with the gifts. You've given me this gift. So that maybe is the first thing, is am I aware of the gift that God has given to me, the talents that he's given to me? So then I can say, look, Lord, you gave me these talents, and look what I did with them. Look how I expanded your kingdom. I was diligent. I was disciplined. I relied on your resources as I brought forth fruit for your kingdom. And then in that moment, what do we hear? Well done, my good and faithful servant. I was thinking of this, my good. It's not just well done, good and faithful servant, but it's well done, my good and faithful servant. You think of a covenantal language of just I am yours and you are mine. You're not just any servant, but you're my servant. And this is what we all want to hear. The Lord saying to us, you belong to me and I belong to you, because we're in this covenantal relationship. The divine bridegroom in the parable last week is the same master as this week. And the bridegroom, he weds himself to his bride. And who's his bride? It's the church. It's us. And now this same bridegroom is also our master. And so he calls us. He says, mine, you are my servant, my good and faithful servant. Come, share your master's joy. It's not just that he wants to share resources, but that he wants us to share in his joy. And you just think about that. The kingdom of heaven, what does the kingdom of heaven offer us? It offers us unending joy. Compared to what does the world offer? What does someone experience who lives a worldly life? that person experiences nothing but anxiety and depression and anger and sadness, fear, right? Because it's a fleeting life. Beauty is fleeting, charm is deceitful, but the kingdom of God lasts forever. And that's rooted out of this sense of fear of the Lord, which is not necessarily afraid of God, but is reverent before him and is always thinking of him and wanting to expand his kingdom. That's what we see going on here in this parable. And it's the same thing with the second one. And then, of course, the one who's distorted by sin, who can't seem to take his eyes off of things of this world, maybe we could say, who's lazy, slothful, one of the 7 deadly sins. He's lazy, you wicked, lazy servant. Right? He's like, I know you're a demanding person. And notice how the Lord doesn't try to correct him. Because there are some people, we know this, there are some people, you just can't correct them. They have false ideas about God, and for whatever reason, you can't get those ideas out of their mind. And so it's just like, fine, the Lord's going to deal with that. And part of the Lord dealing with that, sometimes he's merciful, but sometimes he's also just. And that justice is going to say, fine, you knew it. You should have at least not been lazy. You should have not been slothful. Then I could have at least gotten it back with interest. Anyway, so this I think there's a lot going on here, and it's a beautiful parable, but also at the same time, it's a beautiful warning from the Lord, where he shows us his generosity. I think that's a big point of this parable that a lot of people might miss. He's very generous, but because of his generosity, he expects us to go to work for his kingdom, which, like, we're going to work not just for a mean, demanding master, but we're going to work for a generous, loving God who wants us to share in his joy. To remember that joy is on the other side, and because it's on the other side, therefore it can be a part of the work for his kingdom. Beautiful. Okay, we'll see for the next reading. Like I said, the second reading is also really good, and I think it's very related to this, so I'm looking forward to it. God bless you.